Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Tippy webinar series, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Ashley Durham. I am the Director of Alumni Engagement at the Tippy College of Business. The Tippy webinar series is an initiative of the Alumni Engagement Department, and our goal is to bring the knowledge of our wonderful faculty and wonderful staff to you wherever you may be in the world. I'm excited to have Daniel Newton with us today as he talks to us about the power of voice in organizations. Some information before we get started. We have a lot of content to share with you today, so we'll do our best to get to your questions at the end of today's presentation. If you have a question that's unanswered, you are always welcome to email Daniel directly. And please use the Q&A feature within the bottom of the Zoom platform, not to be confused with the chat box. We will be looking for those questions in the Q&A. As a reminder, all of our virtual presentations are uploaded to the college's YouTube page a few days following our live webinar event. We also encourage you to stay until the end of the webinar so that we can gather your thoughts on today's presentation. Your feedback helps make our virtual programming even better, and we appreciate you taking time to answer a 5-question survey at the end of our webinar today. Now I would like to introduce Daniel Newton. Daniel is an assistant professor of management and entrepreneurship at the Tippy College of Business. Daniel's research focuses on the causes and consequences of speaking up at work and how employees invest their energies as they transition between work tasks. A recipient of an 8-year NASA grant, he has conducted research with astronauts aboard the International Space Station, isolated crews in Houston, and cosmonauts in the Mars Training Facility in Moscow. Prior to joining academia, Daniel worked in corporate finance and strategy at a Fortune 50 firm. Thanks so much for being here today, Daniel, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Ashley, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted to meet with you today and chat a little bit about the value of voice at work. And I hope to share just a number of insights that you can apply. And I think that we'll have a great time discussing this. So thank you again for being here. A couple things to keep in mind just at the beginning. I want you to think of maybe a vexing issue or a vexing challenge that you face at work, something that you think could be improved. And as we talk today, I would like you just to think about maybe some ideas or ways that you could enhance that, and potentially ways that you could speak up about that to others on how you can solve this issue. And so maybe just keep that in the back of your mind. And also, I'm going to share just a number of different suggestions or solutions that are research-based regarding how we speak up at work. And maybe that can feel overwhelming, right? Where you're in a flower shop and you're wondering, like, which of all these bouquets should I purchase? You don't have to buy all of what I say today. But maybe there's a nugget or two or one bouquet that you could purchase that you could implement to your benefit to make your job and your organization a bit better. And then finally, I think an assumption that I make that I just want to make clear is that there are ideas and solutions that are scattered among us. And it's not just the CEOs that have the good ideas at a corporation. It could be anybody. It could be anybody from the newest employee to the oldest employee. It could be someone that doesn't have a lot of experience to somebody who has a lot of experience. And so just being open to different suggestions and ideas is how I approach my research on voice, and I think is maybe a valuable lens just for you to be aware of as I speak today. So what is voice? How do we think about speaking up at work? Just a nice definition to get started is voice is the expression of new ideas or problems that need to be resolved that are expressed with the intent to improve things at work. And really, why does voice matter? Well, it gives employees a seat at the table. It shows them that their perspective is worth hearing, that others want to know what they're thinking, and that what they share can make a difference to make things better for them and for others at work. I love this quote from George Bernard Shaw when we think about the value of voice, where he said, people are always blaming their circumstances for what they are. I don't believe in circumstances. The people who get on in this world are the people who get up and look for the circumstances they want. And if they can't find them, they make them. And I think that voice is a wonderful mechanism to change our environments, to improve our surroundings. And it can be used in wonderful and powerful ways at work. And so instead of just like taking the status quo as given, like this is the way things are, voice is a way to initiate change and initiate positive change. So for employees, how does voice matter? Why does voice matter? So a number of research studies that I've conducted, as well as other research, shows that when people speak up with new ideas or even problems that could be resolved, and their managers see them as better employees, as better performers, as doing their job more effectively. And so if you're wondering how you can improve your performance at work, one way to do that is to speak up with suggestions, creative and new ideas. Now, also, there's different ways that we can speak up. I did a study, and there's the link there below. Those who share ideas are seen as competent and reputable. Other people see them as smart, and they're like, do you know what? This is someone that I could get behind. Also speaking up in a more supportive way. So if my coworker says something and I say, do you know what, that's a great idea, we should run with that. When I do that, other people would then see me as more warm and friendly, right? I'm a team player. And then others want to collaborate with those that speak up in more supportive ways. So for employees to speak up, there's a lot of runway as far as kind of organizational value for them to do that. Now, is this valuable for organizations? Absolutely. Now, when organizations collectively receive voice, those organizations are better performing. There's more learning that occurs. There's greater levels of creativity. And you can see some of these statistics in a variety of industries. In the financial services, a 20% increase in performance, financial performance, or increased sales at a restaurant company, a reduction in turnover. People are more likely to stay, right? Because they're cultivating an environment that can improve and that kind of reflects growth and improvement. And so organizations should want employees to speak up with new ideas. Now, what factors in general predict speaking up at work? I conducted, along with some colleagues, a meta-analysis, which is a summary of summaries. And we found 5 main factors that predict whether people speak up or not. 2 of them are more personality centric. Extroverts speak up more than introverts. That makes sense. Also, people that are more likely to take initiative are people that are more likely to speak up and suggest changes to the status quo. There's a couple other factors I want to highlight. The third one is this notion of felt responsibility. So if I feel accountable for something, if I have some skin in the game, I'm going to speak up about that. And so the more that you can do to have skin in the game, or if you're a manager, to give the people that report to you, to give them greater involvement and more skin in the game, the greater the likelihood that they will speak up. The next is psychological safety. And you may have heard this term before. Psychological safety is where you feel comfortable speaking up and sharing ideas, and that it's not going to be held against you. And so psychological safety is this positive environment where people feel like they can challenge the status quo, where they feel like they can rock the boat a little bit and that it will be okay. And I'll circle back to this notion of psychological safety and how we can really kind of build environments of psychological safety, because it's a really crucial point that I want to highlight. And then the final thing is leader openness. This is leaders who are engaged with the people around them. They're willing to hear them out. They're willing to go out and seek input from their subordinates. And I think this is also a key point as well, and one that I'll circle back to in greater detail. Like, how can you be an open leader? Or maybe if you don't have an open leader, what are things that maybe you could help to move the needle to encourage a leader to be a bit more open to your suggestions? So this gets us to an initial question, which is, why is speaking up so hard? If it's so wonderful for employees, if employees are seen as better performers, if companies are better when their people are speaking up and sharing insightful suggestions and creative solutions, why is it so hard? And on one hand, maybe at a fundamental level, there's this notion of the status quo bias, that people tend to stick with the status quo. And that means that we're more concerned about the risks associated with rocking the boat than the risks that would be associated with failing to change. And for a lot of people, I mean, you may have heard the saying, like, it's just the way things are, or it is what it is. And that's the status quo, right? We can't change things around here. and nor is there a desire potentially to change things. And the status quo bias is a very strong factor that kind of restricts people from speaking up. So just to highlight the status quo bias and kind of two interesting studies. So 20 years ago, Science published a study about organ donation in Europe. And you can see the effect of how many people consented to donate organs by different countries. And there's some very distinct differences that arise between the four countries on the left: Denmark, Netherlands, the UK, and Germany, and those on the right, which was those countries on the left had an explicit consent where individuals had to opt in to donate, whereas on the right there was a presumed consent where individuals had to opt out. And essentially what this highlights is that individuals tend to stick with the status quo. And there's another example that highlights this as well. You may have heard this with 401ks, where there's research done on this. And so this was with a Fortune 500 kind of insurance and healthcare company, where initially people could only contribute to the 401k after they had been there for 1 year, and then they had to opt in. And the company changed things where new hires could automatically enroll. But they were able to do an experiment, quasi-experiment of sorts. And what we see here is that the new hires, 86% of them were more likely to contribute to their 401ks when they were automatically enrolled, whereas when they weren't, only 57% were. And that's a significant difference. Just highlighting both this organ donation and 401k contributions, the value or the challenge with the status quo. And so that can be a hurdle when we're speaking up. And so what are ways that we can overcome the status quo? What are other ways that speaking up is hard when we think about navigating some of these complex processes? The first one, and maybe these worries that accompany us when we think about rocking the boat and trying to change things, is we don't want to look stupid. We have a perspective, and maybe we're willing to share it, but we don't want to embarrass ourselves. To this point, a study from in the late 90s highlighted just a quote from one individual who said, "I know people are afraid to say anything these days, and they're probably also afraid to bring up an idea for fear someone's going to say, it's a pretty dumb idea, you know?" And I think that's something that we all worry about. We don't want to look stupid. We don't want to embarrass ourselves. And so what can we do to overcome this? Here's one solution on a research study that I'm in the process of conducting at the moment, which is going to a sounding board before prime time. So if you have an idea that you want to share, maybe pitch it to somebody else, rehearse it with somebody else. So what we did in this study is we worked with individuals who pitched ideas at home prior to pitching those ideas at work. And we found that when they sought out a safe sounding board, like a partner or a spouse, that they were not only more committed to their idea, but they also were able to enhance the quality of their idea. And then that led to them speaking up with that idea at work. So if you don't want to look stupid, which I don't think most of us do, try rehearsing your idea with someone before you share it with your boss. Now, it doesn't have to be with a loved one at home. It could be with a coworker. But I think this notion of rehearsing your ideas before prime time can be a valuable way to make sure that your idea is high quality, and you also can get some feedback to enhance your idea. Okay, the second thing, maybe another reason why speaking up can be so hard, or things that we worry about, is we don't want to pressure the boss. We don't want to embarrass our boss. So if we worry about embarrassing ourselves and looking stupid, maybe we don't want to put our boss in the hot seat. And with this, some research has shown that managers hate to be put on the spot in front of others. And so it can be best to brief them first, one-on-one, so the boss doesn't look bad in front of the group. If speaking up involves critiquing a process, a routine, or belief which is important to the boss, they may hold a grudge, right? So we don't want to embarrass the boss because maybe they'll hold it against us. But also, just like us, the people that we work with are human, and our managers don't want to be embarrassed, just like we don't want to be embarrassed. So what can we do? Instead of bringing it up to the boss, maybe we can consider this notion of strategic silence. So this is recent research where instead of kind of pitching it to the boss, maybe pitch it when the boss is in a good mood, for example. So I know I used to work in corporate credit at a very large company, and there were times when the boss simply wasn't, the director simply wasn't kind of in a good emotional state to kind of pitch the changes that we were suggesting. And so we would go at a different time. And so when pitching it to other people, make sure that that other person's going to be responsive to the input that you have. Other thoughts, maybe with strategic silence, making sure that the issue is relevant, maybe also making sure that the issue is ready. If it's just half-baked and it's going to embarrass the boss or put them on the spot, maybe nurturing and cultivating that idea could be valuable. And it could also be valuable, like that quote on the prior slides showed, to kind of run this by the boss prior to the meeting, prior to taking it to everybody else. And so just making sure that we time things, I think, is an important consideration. So that's my second recommendation. If you worry about kind of speaking up, is considering this notion of strategic silence. Speak up, but there may be the time, there may be the right time when you do that. Another reason why we may not speak up, this notion of psychological safety. Maybe we don't feel safe. Maybe we worry about that if we share something, that it's going to be held against us. And so what can we do with that? Here's an example of a positive psychological environment of psychological safety in a team, where this person noted there's much greater openness on this team. It's intangible. We have a personal interest in each other. We're comfortable outside the realm of work. We've shared personal information. If you don't know anything about people, you don't know how to react to them. Our efforts to get to know each other led to our mutual respect. At the core, these are outstanding human beings. So this is Amy Edmondson's research that I'm quoting from here at Harvard, and it highlights the value of getting to know each other at work. If we want to create an environment of psychological safety, we need to get to know each other. We need to feel comfortable around each other. That may mean doing things outside of work, sharing personal information. And that can help foster this environment where we feel more comfortable sharing input that's going to rock the boat a little bit. And my point with psychological safety is that it takes a village. So a recent meta-analysis on psychological safety just highlighted the importance of getting connected with other people around you at work. And so psychological safety is enhanced by these four as well as other conditions, but these are really strong ones. One is having a positive relationship with your leader where you feel like you can trust each other. And so trustworthiness is built by having high ability, high benevolence, high integrity, but having that positive relationship with your boss is so important. The second thing is this notion of interdependence, where you rely on other people and other people rely on you. So if you work in a team setting, pulling your weight and making sure that others really can rely on you and that you're not going to drop the ball. When you don't drop the ball, people tend to reciprocate with that. And that will kind of enhance feelings of mutual psychological safety among team members. The third point with psychological safety is just role transparency and role clarity. It may be hard to to feel psychologically safe if we don't know quite what's expected of us in our job, if there's not transparency or clarity with what we're supposed to do. So that's a conversation that's worth having, and that will have other benefits as well as far as reducing stress and things, but it can also enhance your psychological safety. And then the final point with psych safety is having a supportive work context where peers are in your corner. And I think this gets to the notion that Amy Edmondson's quote on the prior slide highlighted, getting to know the people around you, having personal connections and spending time with them can highlight this positive social work environment where you can feel comfortable speaking up. You think about, are you more willing to speak your mind with your family and your friends or with coworkers that you don't know well? And it's probably the former, right? People that you know well. And so trying to foster those relationships can be important. Another point, the fourth point, why do we worry about speaking up? What are some other worries that we might have? Maybe we feel like we're too new to suggest changes, where it's like, do you know what? I'm new to this job, I'm new to this role, and maybe I don't have all the information. That can be a challenge. And so Michael Parkins, some recent research on strategic silence, he's at Wharton. He has this great quote from one of the individuals that was part of his study, where they said, when I first started at my current company, our sales numbers weren't too great. This was due to the fact that our sales pitch was a bit outdated and needed some tweaking and the lack of training for our sales advisors. I had wanted to bring it up shortly after being hired, but since I was new, I thought it might be a good idea to wait until I was there a little longer before giving my input. Have you ever felt like that? I know I have, where we're worried, and maybe some of these these worries that we have compound, where we worry about looking stupid, but we're also new on the block. And this newcomer issue, though, is real. And so what can we do to overcome it? One is to take heart, to know that newcomers add valuable perspectives that are so key. So recent research by Crystal Farr, who's at the University of Washington, highlighted how newcomers speak up, where they're trying to get a sense of feasibility and desirability, right? Are people going to be open to my suggestions? And is it feasible? Those are real concerns. But there was a study done with Doctor Who, which is a very long running TV show based out of England, where it's been running for decades, and where there's just a lot of different people that have taken part in producing the show and writing the script, et cetera. And what's happened with that, this research study showed a few years ago, is that having newcomers be part of the Doctor Who script was really key in generating new and creative insights. So one thing you can offer as a newcomer, if this is a worry that you have, is you have a fresh perspective. And pairing those fresh perspectives with individuals that have been at the company for a long time can be a valuable, really kind of valuable synergy in helping the company to improve. Because it helps companies not only better organize how they're done, but also process knowledge more effectively and kind of integrate this information that they receive so that the company can improve. And so, again, my point here, if you're a newcomer and you worry about speaking up because you're new, you have just the perspective the company needs to hear, because those are sometimes the ideas that are the most creative. The last thing that I'm going to highlight, reasons why you might worry about speaking up, is maybe you're worried about getting more work, where you're already have so much on your to-do list, your plate is kind of full and overflowing, and you think, if I speak up, this may kind of give me more work. And that concern is kind of well-founded. So some research that I conducted where individuals spoke up at work and their boss said essentially, like, great idea, I love it. And then they throw like a hot potato the idea back to you and ask you to run with the idea. That can be really tricky, because then you have more work to do. And what we found is people felt overloaded after they were delegated their suggestion back, and then they came to regret speaking up. And then that led them to stay silent in the future. And that can be a challenge, right? And so maybe in meetings, you may have found yourself like me thinking, I have something to share, and I think this could help us in our team or in our organization, but I'm not going to do it because, like, I don't care about the idea that much, and I really don't have the bandwidth to take on one more thing. And so that can be a challenge. So what can you do in this situation? Maybe to highlight that first, this issue. This was from somebody in our study. They said, I made a suggestion about something I thought we ought to be doing at work. Whilst the idea was good and my bosses were pleased with the suggestion, I instantly regretted it, as the onus was then put on me to research the new procedure, find out more about it, and then put it into practice. This then meant more work for me at a time when I was already busy. Sometimes it's just easier not to make suggestions so as not to make more work for yourself. I think that's a real concern. And so what can you do? What we found in our study is delegation can be a huge component to minimize the regret and the overload that employees feel. So for leaders, when somebody gives you an idea, instead of just bouncing it back to them and say like, hey, tag, you're it. Instead of doing that, like running with them to say, hey, first asking them, is this something that you're passionate about? Do you want to run with this? And they may surprise you. They may say no, but they may say yes. And if they do, then you can say, okay, how can I help facilitate the enactment of this idea? How can I help guide you throughout this process? So not just leaving them alone on an island, but then delegating to them and helping them in the enactment process will be huge. And what I found in a separate research study is that delegation done right can lead employees feeling this sense of empowerment, right? Where you give them space to and some autonomy to run with things, but you're also there to support them and encourage them. And when they feel empowered, they're more likely to continue voicing, and then that voice leads to enhanced performance. So some final thoughts maybe for managers, as far as like, what can leaders do to create this environment of openness? A few things. One, if somebody gives you a suggestion, thank you for that suggestion. And you can also publicly acknowledge them for that input. And these insights, by the way, are from a Harvard Business Review from Ethan Burris at UT Austin and Jim Dieter, who's at the University of Virginia. The second one is to be transparent with the decision process and timelines. So if somebody gives you a suggestion, don't just let it go into a black hole. Let them know, like, great, we're taking this input and we're going to deal with it this week or next week, just so they know like the timeline, because sometimes things happen and employees never know what happens with their suggestions, which really gets to the last point of closing the loop, circling back with them, letting them know what happened with their suggestion, I think is so important. The third thing employees can do is or managers can do, they can seek input from their employees. Don't just wait. Sometimes asking, like, do you have any ideas for how I can do my job better? Do you have any ideas for how our team can be more effective in responding to this customer demand? And I think you'll be surprised at what employees have to say. The second is power cues and softening those power cues. So instead of, if I'm going to meet with someone as the manager, there may be a desk in between us. Get around the desk, remove some things that may create barriers. And so you can have a conversation without those barriers. Sometimes those physical power cues can be another barrier to voice. Avoiding mixed messages. Sometimes we say one thing with our mouth and then do other things with our actions. And that can be difficult. I remember debriefing with an astronaut a few days after he came home from the International Space Station, and he talked about not feeling heard by NASA Mission Control. And I said, like, why didn't you feel heard? And he said something to the effect of, like, I expect action. Like, if I've said something week after week after week and you don't do anything, I know you're not listening to me. And so that can be an important component, is when people speak up, they expect something to happen. Now, sometimes that can occur, right? Because there may be multiple inputs that you received and you can't do all of them. But that's why the communication with employees is so critical, to say, like, thank you for the suggestion, and then letting them know your thought process and the action that you're taking, and then encouraging them to keep speaking up. The final thing I'll highlight here is employees need to see their supervisors advocating for them. Or I think that can be a powerful thing, that when my employees see that I go to bat for them, that can be a really strong thing, that they know that their voice is valued and taken seriously, because they see their boss then taking it kind of up the ranks and advocating on their behalf. So those are some thoughts for managers, things that managers can do to kind of create that leader openness that's so critical for employee voice to flourish. So let's kind of switch gears a little bit and think about, well, what can employees do? Thinking about like the way that we frame our voice, the way that we speak up. And so I want to give you hopefully some very practical tools for things that you can do as you think about kind of speaking up to those around you. The first is this question of, should you speak up in a direct manner, or should you speak up in an indirect manner? Which is better? Should I be very assertive, or should I be maybe a little less assertive? And I think that there can be pros of both, and I want to highlight that. The first is that sometimes managers can be resistant to voice, because it's a change-oriented behavior where their employees are suggesting that the company do something different. And maybe managers can be a little touchy with that, because maybe it's a process or a work method that they put into practice. And then employees are like, why are we doing this? This doesn't make sense. Let's do something different. And so you can see maybe why managers would hesitate a little bit to very direct voice. And so some research by Chuck Fu Lam out of City University in Hong Kong found that being direct with your voice, so being very assertive, can lead managers to greenlight those ideas, especially when employees are polite in doing that and when they're credible. So when the employee has some street cred, that goes a long way. But then also how you frame it matters. So don't come across as kind of my way or the highway, like this is the only solution here. If you're going to pitch something very directly, I think you'll find the most success, and the research would support this, if you do so in a very polite manner. Now, what about more in an indirect manner? So some recent research that I did with Chuck Fu Lam, who I just mentioned, we looked at this notion of voice inquiry, is what we call it, which is, what if I speak up in the form of a question? And I just asked a question. And so instead of saying, we need to invest more in this market because that will help us be more effective, you could frame that instead as, have we thought about investing in this other market? Might that help us be more effective? And that simple solution, just framing things with the form of a question instead of a direct statement, I think has some runway. And maybe some of this is personality centric, like some people are less assertive than others, and that's fair. But I think that what we found in our research is that instead of putting managers on the hot seat, instead of saying, hey, we need to do this, it's my way or the highway kind of thing, that it creates this kind of conversation, this dialogue that doesn't impose on managers, where it says, essentially, what do you think? And you sincerely ask for their opinion. It's not that you become a pushover or that your opinion is thrown out the door, but you're trying to create this dialogue of a conversation of what can we do to help the company succeed, essentially? What can we do to meet the customer demands? What do you think? And that can go a long way. And what's interesting about this is we found that this notion of voice inquiry or indirect voice was especially effective with managers that are dominant. So if you have a manager that tends towards maybe narcissism a little bit, or if they want to always be right, like pitching voice to them in the form of a question goes a long way because it empowers them and they're more likely to greenlight your idea. And maybe they see themselves as kind of having a seat at the table and generating that idea. And so this may be, I think, is a very simple but effective strategy for not causing other people to be defensive, but then also causing people to still initiate change, even when they want to be right. And so that can be a valuable thing to pursue. Framing voice in the form of a question. What about framing voice as a problem or an opportunity? I think this cartoon from Dilbert's pretty funny, where the manager, the boss says, from now on, we will refer to all of our problems as opportunities. And then someone comes in, well, one of your idiots Spawn was playing with the oven and burned down your house. And then the employee, Wally, I think is his name, says, camping opportunity. So can we frame everything as an opportunity? Maybe. But this gets at this question of should you frame the ideas, the input that you have more as a problem or more as an opportunity? And there's real value in framing things as a problem, but there's also some downsides. So I first want to highlight the value. So some research that I did with a transportation company of a kind of a high-speed kind of light rail is highlighting a problem. If I speak up and say, here's this real issue, we need to resolve this, it creates a sense of urgency. And so kind of like a burning fire where it's like, if I scream fire, 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 people are going to react, and they're going to react very quickly to resolve and put out that fire. And so the value of highlighting voice or problematizing voice is it can create this sense of urgency to take action. So if you have an issue like with this transportation company where we don't have a process for kind of lost children, okay, we got to do this right. We got to do this immediately because there could be children that are separated from their families, and this could be really problematic, et cetera. And so that can be the value of highlighting problems as it creates a sense of urgency. Now, there's a lot of research on the value of kind of problematizing things, that people, like psychologically, were motivated to avoid losses than accrue gains. And so if I receive information about losses, there's a problem, I'm going to react more viscerally and more quickly than if somebody says, hey, here's an opportunity for a gain. And so there's this classic study done in California with a utility company where people went door to door, and essentially they had one of two scripts. If you fail to insulate your home, you will lose X cents per day. Or if you do insulate your home with this, you will save X cents per day. And so people that were given the opportunity framing or the gain framing were less likely to act on this. Whereas people that were told you're going to lose this number of cents per day, they're like, I don't want to lose this money. And so they were more likely to take action. So again, problematizing things creates urgency, creates actions. Now, what are some of the challenges of this? So for employees, this can be challenging because voicing problems actually creates a sense of anxiety in us. So some research that I conducted with some colleagues at Arizona State University, we showed this, that when I speak up with a problem, I'm worried about how other people are going to respond. And that anxiety also leads me to withdrawal in the workforce. And so kind of the person putting their hand over their head, just I'm not as kind of active with my coworkers. Whereas if I voice new ideas, if I frame things as more opportunities, that evokes a sense of pride or a sense of confidence, a sense of I can do this. And that leads me to then seek out connection with my coworkers to actually help them. And so there can be some challenges in like pitching things as problems with how we feel. Now, one thing that we find in our study is that how managers react, if managers react positively, that can kind of eliminate and reduce these feelings of anxiety that occur. But initially, there is that worry that how are people going to take this problem that I'm sharing with them? There's also some implications for managers. So research that I conducted along with some people here, Jennifer Nargan at Iowa and Hudson Sessions, who's at SMU, we looked at how do managers respond when they receive problems or opportunities. And when managers receive problems, it actually hinders their well-being. They feel more emotionally exhausted. And that leads the managers to being seen as worse performers in the eyes of their employees. And this was particularly strong with managers who felt powerless to solve the problems. And so if you have a problem and you're going to pitch it to your manager, maybe a good solution would be try to come up with a solution to that. Because if your manager feels powerless or can't do anything about it, it's going to burn them out. And you're going to see them as a worse performer. And so that's counterproductive for both them and you. Now, on the other hand, on the flip side, in contrast, like for managers, for them to receive new ideas, that promotes their well-being. It reduces their exhaustion, and then they're seen as better performers. And so in general, kind of just like framing the ideas as problems or opportunities, people tend to feel better, more positive emotions with the opportunities, with the new ideas, than they do with the problems. But there's some things that we can do, whether it's coming up with a solution when we're pitching problems, or reacting kind of positively when people share ideas or when people share problems with us as managers. Okay, I know we're nearing towards the end and I can see a lot of good questions in the chat. I haven't read them, but we can kind of talk through these here in a bit. I want to highlight some, the notion or the value of kind of connecting with others at work when you think about speaking up. So earlier I talked about maybe seeking out a sounding board, a loved one, or a coworker, someone that you can run your ideas by before prime time. There can be, I think, tremendous value in connecting with others at work. One point on this, the first point is that as we connect with others, that can provide decision makers this sense of social proof, and that can be very influential. So if I go to my boss and say, I think we need to change this, but so does my coworker, and so does another coworker. Maybe we go together and just say, not in a confrontational way, we don't want to gang up. But if the boss sees multiple people are on board with the change, that can provide this influence tactic, which is social proof, like, it's not just one person, it's not just an isolated event, but a lot of people feel this way. This is an issue. Let's address this. In thinking about linking arms, I want to suggest three specific things that you could potentially do. One is to cultivate ideas. So Pat Satterstrom at NYU has this great paper, this great research study about about cultivating ideas. So it was done in a hospital setting where people, essentially coworkers, would pick up others' ideas after they had fallen by the wayside. And you may have felt this, right? Where you had an idea and it just kind of fell by the wayside and somebody else picked it up for you. And really what they're doing in that process is they're helping you to cultivate the idea, to make it better, to act as an ally with you, with the idea, to co-craft and kind of create this beautiful potted plant together. And so that's something that we can all do as employees, is we can help the people around us. And so if their ideas aren't good, instead of laughing at them, let's help make the ideas better. Let's go to them and say, hey, I've been thinking about your idea and I have some thoughts. Can we talk? I think that can go a long way. And on the flip side, when you're stumped, or if your ideas aren't getting traction, maybe seek out someone else who can help cultivate your idea and help make it better. Another idea is amplification. And so this is a great study done by Kristen Bain, who's at Rochester, where she and others did research about the value of amplifying what others say. And so instead of taking credit for somebody's idea, if somebody else has already said something, I can amplify that. So it's like John said earlier in today's meeting, and then I repeat that with maybe my own perspective. And this notion of amplification doesn't just help me as the amplifier, it also helps the person whose voice I amplified. So if you feel like other people aren't getting heard at work, a great thing that you can do is amplify their voice, because not only are both of you seen as kind of better performers with better ideas and better solutions, but it also increases the value of your input. And this holds true for both men and women. And anecdotally, there was some a Washington Post article years ago about the Obama administration where women felt like they weren't being heard. And so some of them tried this tactic of amplifying each other's voice. And President Obama noticed and started kind of taking their suggestions. And so this notion of amplification can go a long way. So if you don't feel heard at work, maybe talk to someone, see if they can amplify your voice or amplify others, and they'll want to reciprocate. But that can create and highlights the value of linking arms with others. Another thing that you can do is, if you feel like you're not getting heard, is seeking out a representative, someone that can kind of take your voice and speak on your behalf to someone else. And sometimes we think about this with unions, but I don't think this has to just be with unions. I mean, I remember having a colleague once that's saying, "Hey, can you talk to our boss about this?" And in my mind, I was like, "Well, you can do this, right?" But she didn't feel comfortable. And so maybe there's someone that can kind of pitch on your behalf. And these representatives can be especially valuable if there's someone that's not already drowning out kind of the team. So someone that's less dominant and more reflective. So seeking out someone that can be a true representative, and that helps to make things better in the team as far as the team's better performing, and they're also seen as having more expertise. So if you're interested in this research, this was done by Elad Shurf at North Carolina, and just a lot of value, I think, in having a representative potentially. So those are just a few things that I wanted to highlight with as far as linking arms with others in the voice process. So to summarize, we've talked about a lot. I've talked about a lot, and I would love to hear more from you. I wish this could be a bit more of a dialogue. But to summarize, voice is so critical to organizations. It's critical for employees. It's critical for the company. It's critical for managers. And oftentimes every voice isn't heard. And so this is really my, I guess, life's work as far as research. It's just trying to help every voice be heard and finding ways that we can do that. And just want to highlight that everybody's voice matters. Your voice matters. Others' voice matters. And being willing to hear out what other people have to say, I think could go a long way in creating a better business environment. Unfortunately, real hurdles exist, like we've talked about. There's real worries, the status quo bias, as well as specific worries about embarrassing ourselves or embarrassing the boss or not feeling safe or feeling like it's futile because we're a new employee or that we're going to get more work. These real things exist. So what can we do? Well, we can rehearse our ideas. We can time them, the value of strategic silence. We can link arms with others. We can be very intentional on how we frame our voice. Maybe framing it as a problem when there's urgency that we need, or maybe as more idea-centric, and just being a little bit more deliberate instead of just shooting from the hip as things come up. I think that can create a lot of value for us. And then kind of already spilled over into that final one, just being intentional in how we frame and package voice can go a long way. So I really kind of appreciate your attentiveness and your insights. And if you're interested more in this, one point that Ashley said earlier, you can email me, and I'm going to put my slide on the next my email on the next slide, and I'm happy to chat with you. If you want to kind of collaborate or you want to just talk through this in more detail, happy to do so. But also some books that have been written on this point that I think are really good. So Adam Grant at Wharton's, just originals, the value of original perspectives. Jim Dietert about having courage in speaking up. That can be really hard. Or this notion of like creating psychologically safe environments. Amy Edmondson at Harvard has a lot of good insights on this. So these can be books if you're interested in more on this topic that could kind of help scratch that itch a little bit. And then here's my email, daniel-newton@uiowa.edu. Happy to continue this conversation and offline after today. So thank you so much for listening, and look forward to kind of weighing in on some of these perspectives that you shared in the chat.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. And like you noted, we do have some amazing questions, and we've got a lot to get through. So hopefully we can do it. Starting with Dawn, I've worked with leaders who scoff at the words psychological safety. How can you address creating a more open, less risky environment without using that term?
Yeah, and so like I talked about earlier, so it sounds like that's a trigger word, so you probably shouldn't say that. But it also maybe suggests like lack of leader openness a little bit. So some of those suggestions around like linking arms with others, I think could go a long way. Um, and maybe trying to create leader openness, maybe from the back end. So if there's like these barriers when you're talking with your manager, try to reduce those barriers, like removing the desk that's in between you, maybe going for a walking meeting, right? That creates a more level playing field. But doing things and asking for like, okay, where is voice in this process? Like, can you circle back and let me know how things are going? You may have to pull a little bit to create a more kind of open environment, but I think like little things like that could go a long way. But I probably wouldn't use the word if they're not open to it. So.
Another great question is from Jessica. Could you please talk to how you'd market these skills as a positive trait to a current or potential employer? Thinking through how some organizations may be more risk adverse. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jessica. And I think you're right. Not only are some organizations more risk averse, but some kind of managers are more risk averse. And so, I mean, one way with risk aversion is to highlighting things with as a problem, because they're going to that creates this sense of urgency and the sense of, hey, we need to do this. Now, if your company is more risk averse and maybe other companies in the industry are less risk averse, you may kind of engage in some social proof, which is like, hey, other companies are doing this. And then that creates the status quo. And they're like, oh, the status quo is to do this. We should change positively. But that can be a real challenge. And so you may kind of try to encourage and elicit some urgency through, just framing things as more problematic potentially. And you can still do that in a nice way. You don't need to be mean about it. But that may kind of elicit some action that could be valuable.
So building a little bit off of that, Shannon asks, are there specific industries or sectors where the value of employee voice is particularly pronounced?
Yeah, great question, Shannon. I think in like companies or industries where there's just a lot of movement, not a lot of movement, meaning just a lot of change, where they're very dynamic. So you think like high tech or like in the healthcare industry where things are changing. That's where voice is critical because you need to hear how things are going. But when I worked in the corporate world, I worked at a chemical company, and a lot of it was just chemical manufacturing. And I wasn't in operations, but even in that company where things were very, I mean, it's chemistry. And so like the chemistry doesn't change and the process doesn't change per se. But even in that setting, like voice was critical because there's always better ways to do things and there's always new innovations that you can incorporate. And so I think that voice, Shannon, is valuable in any industry. I mean, I'm in education. I think it's valuable in education. When I teach, I don't want to just talk to my students for the whole hour. I want them to share their perspectives because then we can really learn. And then we're kind of blending together 30 perspectives and insights instead of just one person's. So I think voice is valued and valuable in a lot of industries, every industry.
So you mentioned higher ed, but she does have a quick follow-up. Can you provide any specific examples of companies that have embraced employee voice and have been successful?
Yeah, and so I think specific companies that have done this. I think that so Amy Edmondson has talked about like not United Healthcare, Intermountain Healthcare, which is a healthcare company based out west in the Intermountain area. And she has a Harvard Business Review where she highlights some of what they've done to create a valuable like culture of psychological safety as well as voice. And I don't have the exact reference for that Harvard Business Review article, but I can get that. But it's Amy Edmondson in Harvard Business Review. But it's just, again, highlighting that the company leaders, and this is really from the top down, and it can also be from the bottom up, and when they meet together is wonderful, but when the company leaders say, I want to hear from you, and we need to hear from you, and then they don't just talk the talk, but they also walk the walk. So, but that may be a specific company that you could look into.
This question comes to us anonymously. Do you have advice for speaking up in work environments where it is not psychologically safe? Being told that you have a negative attitude for speaking up with clarifying questions. Is it best to leave the organization or to own the organization's culture?
Yeah, it may be a culture thing, and it may be best to leave. But I think there's some things that you could do. So Albert Hirschman wrote kind of the groundbreaking study on voice in 1970. And in that, he talked about exit, voice, loyalty, and then later neglect. And so if you're dissatisfied with things at work, you could quit, right? If things aren't right. But the first thing I think you could do before you quit is to voice. Now, if you voice and people aren't receptive to it and they say you're just a complainer, you're just like finding fault, you could just like take your foot off the gas and become neglectful, or just put your head down and become loyal. Those are real options, and a lot of people do that. But I think with voice, like what happens if you're trying to voice and people aren't listening, it may be the type of voice. They may see you more as a devil's advocate, where you're just speaking up with problems or complaining. And so trying to focus less on the problem side and maybe more on the opportunity side or the idea side. And there may be a voice frequency where maybe you're speaking up too often. So maybe you have to dial it back a little bit. But it could be the culture of the company too, and being receptive to ideas or not. And so I think a very viable option is to quit, but I think you could voice, and I think maybe changing how you frame it, focusing more on the opportunities, maybe also the voice inquiry, framing things in the form of a question, not a confrontational question, but help us learn together how we can do this a little bit better. I think those could be valuable.
This question also comes to us anonymously, but can you please provide more tips on working with a narcissistic manager? I feel that mine is not listening, repeats ideas incorrectly, tears others down, and takes ideas and credit as their own.
Yeah, and so
That's a challenge.
it's a huge challenge, and one that actually motivated the study that I talked about, like framing voice in the form of a question, because we were like, how do you get your ideas across to somebody that doesn't want to listen? And so framing with a question, again, not a confrontational question, but like, have we thought about this? That can go a long way. And maybe there's the risk of them claiming their ideas as their own. And I've just done some preliminary research on that, this notion of credit claiming. And what I found so far, I haven't published anything, but it's that people tend not to enjoy having their ideas stolen. and so where they react very negatively towards their boss and towards others. And so that can be a bad thing. But the first suggestion would be framing it in the form of a question, but also this notion of amplification that I talked about. And so instead of letting them take credit for it, it was like, hey, like Susie said in the meeting last week, and you're very clearly giving credit to the person that came up with the idea. And so where possible, amplifying others' voice so they get credit for it. But I think this notion of what do you do with a narcissist? Go a little softer a little bit. Don't kind of take them on and get the boxing gloves out, but framing things in the form of a question would be most valuable.
Alyssa asks, have you encountered organizations where new employees are tasked with identifying and presenting challenges or improvement areas to management within the first 6 months? If so, is there an approach that is the most effective here? I think the question is, being a new employee is being tasked to identify challenges or areas of improvement to management. And what would be the most effective approach in doing that because they are a new employee to that organization? So I guess if they're coming up with solutions that might be challenging or might go against the status quo.
Exactly. And so I don't know, Alyssa, that's a great question. I don't know of any companies off the top of my head that do this. But what I think the second part of your question is like, what could be most effective? I think companies would do well to be very deliberate about this, to say, like, just create this natural cocoon of psych safety to say, we want new employees to come up with, 5 ideas in their first week and 5 ideas in their second week, and just kind of create this expectation of, we want you to be coming up with new ideas. And you know what? They may not be feasible. But you just don't have the whole narrative yet. You don't know, but like come up with all of these ideas and just create this norm or expectation of, we want the newcomers to speak up. And that, I think, would do wonders for a company, because then that freedom and the feeling of I'm safe to speak up here would persist beyond the 6 months, where they would keep speaking up. And so it would almost just empower the people to feel like they could share positive suggestions. And so I think if I were in training and development or a hiring manager, or a manager that was working with a new employee, I would just give them to say very specific expectations that I want to hear from you, and maybe just 3 suggestions this week and a number next week. And then say they can be wild suggestions. They could be ones that aren't feasible, but let's just there may be a nugget in there that revolutionizes how we can do our work. Great question.
This is from an anonymous attendee. I often have ideas to share and speak up about them, but then find that I'm easily swayed back to the way that my manager was already thinking about that idea. How can I be confident when faced with the manager's objections to the new ideas?
That's a great point. And I think first, maybe to give the manager some credit, the manager may be right. And so there's probably times when it's like, hey, the manager was right. And it's good to change your opinion. Like, I thought this would be good for us, but actually this other avenue, I can see your logic, I can see your point. But there may be other times when the manager is not right. And so what are ways that you can increase your confidence? Again, like running it by others to say like, hey, can you just give me a second set of eyes? Am I thinking through this clearly? That can go a long way just so you feel not only comfortable with the idea, but more confident and more committed to the idea. And if the manager pushes back, trying to just create this dialogue to say, I don't know if I see that all the way, or this is how I see it, like help me understand. I think that's really what voice gets at, is creating a conversation. And so if it doesn't make sense, if you feel like your manager is kind of steamrolling you, or you don't like buy the suggestions or their reasoning, try to open it up to a broader conversation, because that may open the manager up as well to your ideas.
Now we're just getting wonderful feedback for how great this webinar has been. So in the Q&A, so I'm trying to scroll through and find all the good questions, but also Daniel, you're getting a lot of kudos.
I see. Well, thank you, everyone. I see one from an anonymous one who said, like, what if my coworker speaks up with a good idea and is not, but gets ignored? And I think with that one, that would be one where I would amplify them. And I would even circle back to the coworker and say, hey, that's a great idea. I think you should keep speaking up. Like essentially doing what the manager should do, to like give them a pat on the back, a boost to say, you have good ideas, you have good input. But then I think you can amplify them as well and kind of remind everybody what they said. And maybe you can help cultivate those ideas. Maybe they weren't implemented because there's some weaknesses that maybe they don't see, but you do. And so you can help them to kind of nurture and help grow their idea to something that's a little more feasible. So great idea, or great suggestion.
Thank you for picking that out amongst all these wonderful kudos. I think we might have time for 1 or 2 more, but let's start with Teresa's question. As you change your style, approach, and behavior to hear the voice of employees differently, how can you ensure that this shift or change is taken as a genuine change and not something that you're just trying out because you read a new book or you went to a webinar?
That's it, Teresa. Maybe I can just come and just bring me with you. No, I think it does have to be genuine, because I think people notice that. And so I think when we offer input, and maybe a reason why people react negatively, we're like, we need to do this thing. If they know that I'm passionate about it and I have some good ideas and I'm genuine, they may react less negatively to it. And so I think it's good to be genuine, whether you're directly asserting it, whether you're indirect with a question, whether you're framing things in different ways as a problem or an opportunity, whether it's just some new book that you read from Amy Edmondson. And so I think, and some of this just may be a nice entree, like wading into the water, maybe just be a question to say, hey, I read this book and I thought that they had some interesting thoughts. Like, what do you think about this? And that may be just like the momentum that you need to get the ball rolling.
Awesome. Well, I think we might be at time, unless Daniel, you see any that you can pick out of that Q&A real quick. We got about a minute.
And one more thing I would say is, when we think about like speaking up, often, like, should you like beat the same drum over and over, or should you speak up about a lot of things? Because I know sometimes people speak up in meetings where like, I've heard this a million times. It's like their passion project, you know what I mean? And what I've found in some research is actually it can be beneficial to speak up about a broad number of things. instead of just having the same kind of nail or hammer that, you know what I mean, that you speak up about the same thing over and over, giving managers a variety of things that they can implement can go a long way. Because if you just give them one option every time you speak up, the same thing, it's hard for them maybe to do that because of a variety of restrictions. But if you give them optionality, A through Z, chances are they're going to implement a lot more of those things. So that's another consideration that you might find valuable.
And I saw a quick question about if this is being recorded. It absolutely is, and it will be on the college's YouTube channel following our webinar today. And we are at time. So I just want to say thank you so much, Daniel. This has been so informative and such a wonderful webinar. And thank you to everyone else for attending the Value of Voice today. When the event ends in just a moment, you'll see a quick survey. We'd be grateful if you could share your thoughts on today's webinar and help make future webinars and our virtual events even better. On behalf of the Tippie College of Business, thank you for joining us this afternoon. And as always, go Hawks.